They dubbed her Oddball. Little did they suspect she was a back-alley brawler. Seraphina Bloom had been enrolled at Crestwood Academy for precisely a month when it dawned on her that she'd greatly misjudged the situation, thinking this new place would offer a fresh start. At 17 years of age, she was unusually tall and thin, sporting unruly dark blonde hair that perpetually fell into her eyes, fair complexion often flushed, and thick-framed spectacles perched precariously on her nose. Her attire never quite matched, cast-offs from her older brother that were either too baggy or too snug, and she tended to slump her shoulders as if seeking to shrink from notice. The corridors of Crestwood Academy vibrated with the typical youthful exuberance, yet Seraphina navigated them like a spectre, clutching her battered satchel and casting her gaze downward. She'd transferred here after her dad accepted a promotion across the county, leaving behind the quaint parochial school where she'd successfully faded into the scenery for several years. Everything here felt foreign, immense, rowdy, intimidating. "Hey, watch it, weirdo!" The voice belonged to Brandon Sinclair, a burly senior with meticulously styled light brown hair and an air of unearned superiority. Seraphina had inadvertently collided with him whilst maneuvering through the bustling hallway between morning classes, her folders spilling across the tiled floor. "Sorry," she muttered, kneeling to gather her scattered papers. Other students sidestepped her, some smirking, others simply dismissing the scene altogether. Brandon's crony, Kyle Harrison, a towering redhead with icy green eyes and a constant sneer, nudged one of Seraphina's notebooks further down the hall. "Whoops!" he uttered with feigned remorse. "Butterfingers." The third member of their clique, Tiffany Sterling, Seraphina bristled at the coincidence of the popular girl sharing her grandmother's surname, stood with folded arms, her immaculately painted nails drumming against her suede jacket. "Honestly, what is she even wearing?" Tiffany remarked loud enough for a sizable portion of the hallway to overhear. "Did she raid a charity shop's clearance bin?" Seraphina's face burned as she scrambled to retrieve her dispersed belongings. She could sense the whispers commencing, observe phones being extracted to document her mortification. This was precisely what she'd been striving to circumvent. Keep a low profile, her father had always cautioned her. Avoid attracting attention. Don't provide them with a pretext to single you out. But they'd noticed regardless. The chime sounded and the hallway began to empty. Seraphina finally managed to gather her papers, her fingers trembling slightly as she crammed them back into her bag. Brandon was long gone, yet she could still discern Tiffany's laughter echoing off the lockers. In biology class, Seraphina sank into her customary spot at the rear of the room. Her lab partner, a timid boy named Felix, offered her a sympathetic glance but remained silent. Nobody ever intervened. That was the unspoken code. Steer clear, don't rock the boat, don't become a target yourself. The tormenting had initiated subtly, murmured remarks concerning her looks, her clothes, her manner of walking. Then it escalated to unintentional shoulder brushes in the corridor, mysterious disappearances of her lunchbox, anonymous notes affixed to her locker branding her with names she preferred not to recall. Brandon seemed to derive particular satisfaction from rendering her life miserable, and Kyle and Tiffany were perpetually poised to participate or furnish an audience. What they failed to grasp, what nobody at Crestwood Academy realized, was that Seraphina Bloom wasn't merely some awkward newcomer struggling to navigate high school. For the preceding 7 years, she'd been training in kickboxing at a rundown dojo in her former district. Her instructor, a retired cop named Victor Rossi, had taken her under his wing when she was 10 years old and imparted upon her not solely how to fight, but when to fight. "Violence is never the ideal solution, kiddo," Victor had always asserted, his calloused hands enveloping worn punching mitts as Seraphina practiced her combinations. "But if someone endeavors to harm you or someone you care about, You best be prepared to defend yourself. The key is discerning the difference between defense and aggression. Serafina had secured 2 regional titles before turning 16, competing under the alias Silent Fury for her calculated strikes and her signature technique, a swift sequence of body blows culminating in a devastating spinning heel kick. But she'd never disclosed this to anyone at school. Fighting was her clandestine world, distinct from the meticulous invisibility she maintained elsewhere. Even her dad was unaware of the competitions. He presumed Serafina simply attended the dojo for fitness and self-esteem. If he discovered that his daughter was actually battling other teenagers in rings surrounded by clamoring spectators, he'd likely suffer a stroke. Thus, Serafina persevered. She evaded confrontations, disregarded the taunts, and counted down the days until graduation. She convinced herself it was the sensible course of action, the intelligent choice. Instigating fights would only exacerbate matters. However, Brandon Sinclair was rendering that principle increasingly untenable. It was a Wednesday afternoon when matters finally reached a breaking point. Serafina was seated alone in the atrium, nibbling at her salad and attempting to decipher her physics equations, when Brandon and his posse materialized at her table like a looming thunderstorm. "Well, well, well," Brandon announced, plopping into the seat opposite her uninvited. "If it isn't the resident freak show, what's on the menu today? Looks like misery with a side of pathetic." Kyle and Tiffany encircled him, forming a semicircle of animosity that made Serafina feel cornered. She fixated her gaze on her equations, her pencil gliding steadily across the page, even though she could no longer concentrate on the formulas. "I'm addressing you, weirdo," Brandon declared, his voice escalating in volume. Other students were beginning to turn and observe, sensing an impending conflict. "It's impolite to disregard individuals when they're attempting to engage in conversation." "I'm merely trying to eat my lunch," Serafina responded softly, still not glancing up. "Oh, she's capable of speech." Tiffany clapped her hands derisively. "I was beginning to suspect you were mute in addition to everything else." Brandon extended his arm across the table and flicked Serafina's salad, sending chunks of lettuce and tomato cascading across her homework. "Whoops," he said, echoing Kyle's favored mock apology. "Looks like you've created a mess. Better tidy that up." Serafina's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, but she compelled herself to remain composed. She could feel her pulse quickening, the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded a confrontation. But this wasn't the ring. This was school, and rules applied here, repercussions. She commenced gathering the remnants of her salad, her movements deliberate and controlled. Surrounding them, the atrium had fallen silent save for the hushed whispers of students who sensed that something significant was about to transpire. "You know what I suspect?" Brandon continued, relishing his audience. "I suspect you're not solely odd-looking. I suspect you're likely odd in other respects as well. Like, what sort of oddball transfers schools halfway through senior year? What were you fleeing from?" Serafina's jaw tightened, but she persisted in cleaning up the mess, depositing the ruined food on her lunch tray. "Perhaps she was expelled," Kyle suggested with a smirk. "Perhaps she was too much of a freak even for her previous school. Or perhaps," Tiffany added with feigned concern, "she committed something truly deranged, like injuring someone. You know how reserved individuals are, invariably the most treacherous." That struck closer to home than Serafina cared to acknowledge. She gathered her books and began to rise, poised to escape before matters deteriorated further. But Brandon was quicker. He extended his hand and seized her wrist, his grip sufficiently tight to inflict pain. "Where do you imagine you're going?" he inquired. "We haven't concluded our conversation as yet." For an instant, Serafina's training took over. She could break Brandon's hold in 3 distinct manners, without even consciously thinking about it. She could have him prone on the floor in under 5 seconds, gasping for air and questioning what in the world had just occurred. The muscle memory was ingrained, the techniques burned into her nervous system through years of practice. But she refrained. Instead, she met Brandon's gaze for the first time since he'd sat down and stated softly, "Release me." Something flickered across Brandon's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition that he might have overstepped his boundaries. But with Kyle and Tiffany observing, with a sizable portion of the atrium now openly staring, he couldn't retreat without losing face. "Make me," he retorted, tightening his grip. Serafina stared at him for a protracted moment, and Brandon felt a chill crawl down his spine. There was something in her blue eyes that he'd never witnessed previously, something that made him suddenly question whether perhaps this hadn't been such a prudent course of action. Then Serafina smiled, and it wasn't the nervous, apologetic smile he was accustomed to seeing from her. It was something altogether different. "All right," she stated simply. What ensued transpired in precisely 4 seconds, though it felt like slow motion to everyone observing. Serafina twisted her wrist in a manner that shattered Brandon's grip instantly, the movement so fluid and practiced that it appeared almost effortless. Simultaneously, she grasped his pinky finger and bent it back at an angle that caused him to gasp and recoil. Brandon found himself half standing, bent over the table at an awkward angle, his hand contorted in Serafina's grasp. The pain was sharp and immediate, but more significantly, he was suddenly cognizant that she was entirely in control. She could snap his finger with a mere twist of her wrist, and they both recognized it. "I requested you politely," Serafina stated, her voice still soft, but possessing an edge that prompted Kyle and Tiffany to step back instinctively. "Now I'm instructing you, refrain from touching me again." She released his hand, and Brandon stumbled backward, cradling his sore finger against his chest. Surrounding them, the atrium had fallen completely silent, save for the hum of the vending machines and the distant clatter of utensils from the cafeteria. Serafina picked up her tray and departed, leaving Brandon staring after her with a mixture of bewilderment and something that might have resembled fear. She dumped her lunch in the trash and exited the atrium without glancing back, aware that every gaze in the room was tracking her. For the remainder of the day, Serafina couldn't dispel the sensation that something had fundamentally altered. She'd crossed a threshold, revealed a glimpse of her true self beneath the meticulous facade of awkward invisibility. Students she'd never addressed were regarding her differently, and she could sense Brandon's gaze upon her whenever they passed in the hallway. She ought to have felt remorseful, perhaps, or concerned about the ramifications. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: relief. That evening, Serafina visited her old dojo for the first time since transferring schools. Victor cast a glance at her face and nodded toward the heavy bag without uttering a word. She devoted an hour to venting her frustration on the leather, her combinations precise and forceful, each strike bearing the weight of weeks of suppressed anger. "Feeling better?" Victor inquired when she finally ceased, perspiration streaming down her face. "I suspect I messed up," Serafina responded, removing her gloves. "What transpired?" She recounted the incident with Brandon, the cafeteria, the expression in his eyes when she'd seized his hand. Victor listened without interruption, his expression pensive. "You could have injured him," he stated when she concluded. "I desired to, but you refrained. That's what's paramount." Victor handed her a towel. "Listen, kiddo, I've been training fighters for 20 years. I can inform you that knowing how to fight and knowing when to fight are 2 entirely distinct skills. You performed commendably today." "It doesn't feel that way." "That's because you're not a bully," Victor stated. "Bullies derive pleasure from inflicting harm on others. You don't. But that doesn't imply you must be a victim either." Serafina nodded, but she couldn't dispel the sensation that she'd initiated something she might be unable to control. She was accurate. The subsequent morning, Brandon was awaiting her at her locker. This time, he'd brought reinforcements, not solely Kyle and Tiffany, but 3 additional seniors Serafina didn't recognize. They formed a loose circle around her as she worked her combination, their presence intimidating without being overtly menacing. "We need to converse," Brandon stated. His finger was encased in a small bandage, Serafina noted. "I'm listening," she replied, not turning around. "What you executed yesterday was cute," he stated. "Real cute. But you humiliated me in front of the entire school, and that's not something I can simply disregard." Serafina closed her locker and finally turned to confront him. Brandon was attempting to project confidence, but she could discern the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't certain of her capabilities any longer, and that rendered him perilous in a different manner. "I didn't humiliate you," Serafina stated calmly. "You humiliated yourself." Kyle stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Who do you imagine you are, addressing Brandon in that manner?" "I'm someone who merely desires to be left alone," Serafina replied. "That's all I've ever desired." "Well, tough luck," Tiffany stated with a sneer. "You rendered this personal when you elected to get all kung fu on Brandon. Now you must confront the consequences." Serafina surveyed the circle of hostile faces and felt a familiar calm descend upon her. This was it then. The moment Victor had always cautioned her about, when walking away was no longer an option. "What consequences?" she inquired. Brandon smiled, but it failed to reach his eyes. "After school, the parking lot behind the gymnasium. You and me, one-on-one. We resolve this appropriately. And if I fail to appear, then we render your life a living nightmare until you graduate," Brandon stated. "And trust me, we're creative when we choose to be." Serafina contemplated her options. She could inform a teacher, but that would merely exacerbate matters in the long run. She could have her dad transfer her to another school, but Brandon's threat would pursue her anywhere. Or she could appear and conclude this once and for all. "Fine," she stated. "After school." Brandon blinked, clearly not anticipating her to agree so readily. "Fine," he reiterated, attempting to regain his composure. "Don't chicken out." The group dispersed, leaving Serafina alone by her locker. Surrounding her, students whispered and stared, the news of the impending fight already disseminating through the school's social networks. Serafina gathered her books and proceeded to first period, attempting to disregard the excited chatter that followed her down the hallway. Word of the fight disseminated faster than Serafina had anticipated. By lunchtime, it appeared that the entire school was cognizant of the showdown scheduled for after school. Students approached her throughout the day, some offering counsel, others merely desiring to obtain a closer look at the girl who had somehow managed to intimidate Brandon Sinclair. Serafina attempted to concentrate on her classes, but her mind persistently drifted to what was approaching. She'd never fought outside the ring previously, never had to contend with the possibility of genuine repercussions beyond losing a match. If she severely injured Brandon, she could be expelled, arrested, perhaps even sued, but if she restrained herself excessively, she might be the one who ultimately sustained injuries. The final bell rang at 3:15, and Serafina made her way toward the parking lot behind the gymnasium. A crowd had already assembled, forming a loose circle in the asphalt space between the gym and the chain-link fence that separated the school from the residential neighborhood beyond. Someone had even established a phone to document the fight, the red recording light blinking like a tiny eye. Brandon was already present, surrounded by his customary crew, plus several other students Serafina didn't recognize. He'd changed out of his school attire into a sleeveless shirt and jeans, clearly anticipating this to be a serious fight. When he saw Serafina approaching, he stepped into the center of the circle. "Wasn't certain you'd appear," he called out. Serafina walked to the opposite side of the circle, shrugging off her backpack and handing it to Felix, who had somehow ended up at her side. I stated I would. Yeah, well, stating and doing are two distinct things, Brandon retorted, bouncing on his toes like a boxer. Just so we're clear on the rules here, this is between you and me. No weapons, no assistance from friends. We proceed until one of us surrenders or is unable to rise again. Serafina nodded, pulling her hair back into a tight ponytail. Sounds equitable. Brandon cracked his knuckles and grinned. Don't fret, weirdo. I'll endeavor not to disfigure that pretty face too much. The crowd laughed, but Serafina noticed it sounded forced. The students assembled around them seemed more apprehensive than excited now that the moment had actually arrived. She wondered how many of them had ever witnessed a genuine fight, not solely the meticulously choreographed violence of movies and television. You ready? Brandon inquired, raising his fists. Serafina settled into her fighting stance, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet, her hands loose at her sides. It was a stance Victor had drilled into her thousands of times, designed to appear deceptively casual while actually being perfectly positioned for attack or defense. Brandon charged forward without warning, throwing a wild haymaker aimed at Serafina's head. To the observing students, his punch appeared swift and forceful. To Serafina, who had devoted years to sparring with trained fighters, it might as well have been in slow motion. She stepped to the side, allowing Brandon's fist to whistle past her ear, and drove her right hand into his ribs with surgical precision. The sound of her knuckles connecting was akin to a baseball bat impacting a watermelon, and Brandon doubled over with a gasp that could be heard clearly in the sudden silence. Serafina stepped back, awaiting him to recover. She could have followed up with a knee to his face or an elbow to the back of his neck, but this wasn't about severely injuring him. This was about making a point. Brandon straightened up, his face red and his breathing labored. He looked at Serafina with something approaching respect, and for a moment she thought he might call it off. Instead, he came at her again, this time more cautiously. He threw a combination of punches that would have overwhelmed most high school students. But Serafina slipped and weaved around them like water flowing around rocks. Her movements were fluid and economical, wasting no energy while making Brandon appear clumsy and off balance. When she perceived her opening, Serafina struck. A swift jab to Brandon's solar plexus folded him over, and an uppercut that she pulled at the last second still possessed sufficient force to snap his head back and drop him to his knees. Brandon knelt on the asphalt, gasping for breath, blood trickling from his split lip. Surrounding them, the crowd was completely silent, save for the sound of phones recording and the distant hum of traffic on the street beyond the fence. "Stay down," Serafina stated softly, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. Brandon looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. There was fear there, yes, but also understanding. He was beginning to realize exactly how outmatched he was. But pride is a potent force, especially when you're 17 years old and your reputation is on the line in front of a portion of your school. Brandon struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but raising his fists again. "I'm not done," he mumbled through his swollen lip. Serafina sighed. "Yes, you are." What ensued lasted approximately 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds redefined everything anyone at Crestwood Academy thought they knew about Serafina Bloom. Brandon threw another punch, and Serafina caught his wrist, twisted it, and utilized his own momentum to throw him over her hip in a perfect judo throw. Brandon impacted the asphalt forcefully, the impact expelling the air from his lungs. Before he could recover, Serafina was upon him, her knee pressing against his chest, her hand wrapped around his throat in a grip that was firm, but not quite tight enough to cut off his air supply. "I stated stay down," she reiterated, her voice still soft, but possessing an edge that prompted several students in the crowd to take a step backward. Brandon stared up at her, completely helpless, and Serafina could see the precise moment when his worldview shifted. She wasn't the odd, awkward newcomer he'd been tormenting for weeks. She was something else entirely, something dangerous that had been concealing itself in plain sight. "Do you surrender?" Serafina inquired. Brandon nodded frantically and Serafina released him, standing up and stepping back. Brandon rolled onto his side, coughing and gasping, his face a map of bruises and cuts that would require weeks to heal. Serafina surveyed the circle of shocked faces staring back at her. Some of the students appeared frightened, others impressed, but all of them were seeing her clearly for the first time. "Anyone else?" she inquired. Kyle and Tiffany, who had been so eager to support Brandon when the fight commenced, were now standing as far from the action as possible. Neither of them met her eyes. Serafina picked up her backpack and walked toward the edge of the circle. The crowd parted before her as if she were carrying a contagious disease, students stepping over themselves to get out of her way. "Serafina!" Someone called out behind her. She turned to see Felix jogging to catch up, his face flushed with excitement. "That was incredible," he stated when he reached her. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "Around," Serafina replied, settling her backpack on her shoulders. They walked together toward the school's main entrance, leaving behind the crowd that was still buzzing with shock and excitement. Brandon was sitting up now, Kyle and Tiffany fussing over him, but Serafina could feel his gaze on her back as she walked away. The subsequent few days at Crestwood Academy were unlike anything Serafina had experienced. Students who had never given her a second glance now nodded respectfully when they passed her in the hallway. The whispered remarks concerning her appearance ceased entirely, replaced by awed speculation about her fighting background. Brandon returned to school on Thursday with a face that resembled he'd been struck by a truck, but he gave Serafina a wide berth and didn't make eye contact. Kyle and Tiffany seemed to have discovered new interests that didn't involve tormenting transfer students, and the minor power structure that had rendered Serafina's life miserable crumbled almost overnight. But perhaps the most surprising alteration was in Serafina herself. She no longer slumped her shoulders or kept her eyes on the ground when she walked through the school. She sat wherever she chose in the atrium, spoke up in class discussions, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from within. On Friday afternoon, as Serafina was loading books into her locker, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Brandon standing there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face still bearing the colorful evidence of their encounter. "I desired to converse with you," he stated, his voice subdued. Serafina waited, saying nothing. "I owed you an apology," Brandon continued. "What I perpetrated upon you, what we perpetrated, it wasn't justifiable. I recognize that now." "Why?" Serafina inquired. "Why did you perpetrate it?" Brandon was quiet for a protracted moment, staring at the floor. "I don't know," he stated finally, "because I could, I suppose. Because it rendered me feel powerful, picking on someone who couldn't retaliate." He looked up at her. "Except you could retaliate. You merely chose not to. Until I didn't possess a choice." "Yeah." Brandon nodded. "Listen, I'm not requesting you to forgive me or anything. I merely desired you to recognize that I'm sorry, and it won't transpire again." Serafina scrutinized his face, searching for indications of deception, but observed solely genuine remorse. "All right," she stated simply. Brandon turned to depart, then paused. "Can I inquire something of you?" Serafina nodded. "Where did you learn to fight in that manner?" Serafina smiled, and this time it was the genuine article, warm and sincere. "Around," she stated. Brandon almost smiled back. "Right. Well, I'll see you around, Serafina." "See you around, Brandon." As Serafina walked out of Crestwood Academy that Friday afternoon, she reflected on everything that had altered in merely 1 week. She pondered Victor's words about knowing when to fight and when to walk away, about the distinction between defending yourself and becoming a bully. She'd discovered her line, the point where walking away was no longer an option, and she'd crossed it with purpose and control. More significantly, she'd crossed it without losing herself in the process. Serafina Bloom was no longer the frightened, invisible transfer student attempting to survive until graduation. She was precisely who she'd always been underneath: a fighter, a protector, someone who would stand up for herself and others when it mattered most. And everyone at Crestwood Academy knew it now. 25,118 characters. 26,639 characters.